Our country is heading down an unsustainable fiscal path. For too many years, our federal government has been spending more money than it takes in. I've been hearing about deficit spending for as long as I've been alive. By now you might be wondering, how can we keep on doing this year after year? Well, in fact, we can't continue to do this forever. At some point, we'll have to balance our budget and live within our means. But just how bad is this problem? Let me try and put it into perspective. Let's say that we continue down this unsustainable fiscal path and in the not-too-distant future finally decide that we'll only pay for things we can afford. At that point, we'll have to do more than just cut unnecessary fat out of the budget. We won't be able to afford entire departments, and I'm not talking about tiny obscure ones. We won't be able to afford the Department of Transportation, Veterans Affairs, or the EPA. There would be no money for the Department of Health, NASA, Department of Education, Department of Justice, and the FBI. We won't be able to pay for Homeland Security, Department of Agriculture, National Parks, or even the Department of Defense. That means no Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marines. How could things possibly get so bad for our country? How much time do we have before this budget crisis? I'll show you that in a minute, but first we need to understand about exponential growth. Exponential growth occurs when something increases by a fixed percentage every year. Let's say you invest $1,000 and it earns 7% per year. At the end of the first year, you will have earned 7% of $1,000, which is $70. At the end of the second year, you'll earn 7% of $1,070, which is about $75. So every year, you're earning 7% of a larger amount than the year before. As a result, your earnings increase every year. As you can see from the graph, after 50 years, your initial investment of $1,000 will grow to almost $30,000. We can also see that it takes 10 years for initial amount to double to $2,000, takes another 10 years for that to double to $4,000, another 10 years for that to double to $8,000. So the time it takes the amount to double is always the same. There's an easy way to determine the doubling time for anything that's growing exponentially. Just take the number 70 and divide by the growth rate. For our investment, 70 divided by 7 gives us the 10 years that we saw on the graph. If you have a credit card with 15% interest, the amount would double after just 4.7 years. This is how wealthy families can get even wealthier. After a while, the investment will be growing by an enormous amount every year. In the first year, it only grew by $5, while in the 105th year, it grew by almost $80,000. If my great-grandmother were able to make this investment for me 105 years ago, it would now be worth over $1.2 million. Exponential growth is kind of like a superpower. By nature, it is neither good nor evil, but it can be used to do great things or have very bad consequences. Let's say you're living beyond your means and decide to purchase a new TV even though you don't have the money. You charge $1,000 to your credit card, which has a 15% interest rate. If you let the interest accrue for 50 years and leave the card for your children to pay off, they will owe the bank more than $1 million for a TV that they never even got to use. You, of course, would never do that to your kids. But that, my friends, is what the US government is doing to all of our children. Let's take a look at the federal budget. There are certain items in the budget that are called non-discretionary or mandatory spending, such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the national debt. The government has already promised this money to individuals, so Congress can't just change it. The rest of the budget consists of everything else we think of when we think of government programs, like Department of Defense, Education, Transportation, Health, Environment, and Homeland Security. Every year, Congress decides how much to spend on all of these programs. The federal budget for 2010 was $3.55 trillion. Federal revenue primarily comes from individual income taxes, followed by Social Security payments and corporate income taxes. In 2010, the federal government will bring in about $2.38 trillion. Because we spent more than we brought in, we had a deficit of $1.17 trillion in 2010 and $1.4 trillion in 2009. This, of course, is not free money. The government borrows it, which means that it must be paid back with interest that grows exponentially. Obviously, you could not run your household budget like this. Earning $2,400 a month but spending $3,500 each month is clearly not sustainable and will put you in a big financial hole very quickly, especially when you put the difference of $1,100 on your credit card each month. But this is exactly what our government's been doing for most of the past 40 years. Since 1970, the federal government has run deficits for all but 4 years. This year's deficit will be added to last year's deficit along with all the other deficits to make up our national debt, which is now about $14 trillion. This is where our current fiscal path is leading us, deficits increasing year after year. And with continued deficits comes an ever-increasing national debt. Our current national debt is 95% of our GDP, or gross domestic product. You can think of GDP as the value of all the goods and services produced by the entire country in one year. on this path will soon even surpass the debt to GDP ratio that we had during World War II. Another aspect of our unsustainable fiscal path has to do with healthcare costs. As you know, these costs have been increasing rapidly. Assuming you are lucky enough to even have health insurance, this graph shows your health insurance premiums over the past 10 years. Costs are growing by a greater amount each year. It took about 8 years for the cost to double. Using the doubling time formula, this tells us that the percent growth was about 8.7% per year. Healthcare premiums increased by 119% from 1999 to 2008, so you weren't imagining things when it felt like costs were skyrocketing. If we project healthcare costs into the future, we can see how expensive they will get if they continue at this rate for just another 10 years. Remember, at this rate, costs will continue to double every 8 years. It'd be one thing if healthcare costs were increasing at the rate of inflation like other goods and services we buy, but they're not. Or we could afford to pay increasing costs if our earnings were increasing at the same rate, but they're not. Healthcare costs are out of control. This is a major reason why we need healthcare reform. Families need healthcare reform so we can take care of our health without going bankrupt. When you're the federal government and you've promised healthcare to the elderly who need more healthcare to begin with, rising healthcare costs can blow your entire budget to smithereens, especially when there's a huge segment of the population that's getting ready to retire. Hello, baby boomers. All that we've seen so far leads us to this graph. This graph terrified me when I first saw it a few years ago. It shows the cost of budget items over time compared to our GDP. The dotted line shows the government's revenue. If tax policy does not change, the government will always take in about 20% of GDP. The bottom 4 items are all non-discretionary spending. That's money that's already been promised. Notice that the total cost of government is projected to increase dramatically, but not because of other government programs. The rising costs of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the national debt will eat up the entire budget shortly after 2030. Remember in the beginning of the video how I said we won't have money in our budget to pay for all those government programs, including military defense? This graph shows it happening in a little over 20 years. After that, interest payments really get out of control to the point where we spend more on interest than on all other programs combined. 20 years is not that far down the road, and I'm still planning on being around. The worst part of all this is that our children will inherit a bankrupt government through no fault of their own. I didn't just pull this graph off of some random website. It comes from the US GAO, the Government Accountability Office. That's the investigative arm of Congress. For years, the GAO has been saying that our government is on an unsustainable fiscal path, and yet their cry seems to be falling on deaf ears. Now, I'm no economist, but it seems to me that in order to solve this problem, the government needs to either raise taxes, reduce spending, or most likely do a combination of the two. Now, this is not a partisan issue, folks. This is about common sense, taking responsibility for your actions, and not leaving your problems for your children to solve. Two of the top priorities in the Republican Party's pledge to America are to repeal healthcare reform law and to extend Bush's tax cuts for all Americans. But the Congressional Budget Office has estimated that the healthcare reform law will save the government $140 billion over the next 10 years. The idea of keeping tax cuts in place when we're running billion-dollar deficits made me very concerned, so I read the GAO's most recent report, which Congress got in January of 2010. This graph shows the same information as the previous one, but it contains more recent data and assumes that the Bush-era tax cuts are extended for all Americans. In this scenario, the government won't have enough money to pay for all of their programs in a little over 10 years. And by 2030, the interest payments on the national debt will be the largest single expenditure in the federal budget. Our country is driving right for a cliff, and the Republican plan is to step on the gas. And Democrats want to extend the tax cuts for only the middle class. Well, that would be awfully nice for me, and I would love to keep my taxes low if we were on a sustainable fiscal path, but we're not, so that's not fiscally responsible either. I find it incompetent that many in Congress have looked at this information and then decided that we should continue any of Bush's tax cuts. When I saw this graph, I realized that I needed to do something about this issue other than just getting upset. This video is my attempt to spread the word about the issue to as many people as possible. This is one crisis that we can work to minimize before it happens instead of reacting to it after the fact. The longer Congress waits to act on this issue, the more painful the solution will be. If Congress continues to do nothing, taxes will need to double in order to close the financial gap in 2040. I personally would rather have my taxes raised a little bit now instead of having my children pay 40% in taxes. It's time to rear up on our hind legs and show Congress what a real mama bear looks like. David Stockman, President Reagan's budget director, has said, "We couldn't afford the Bush tax cuts when they were put in 2001 and 2003. Now we're 8 years later, we're trillions in additional debt later, we're 2 unfinanced wars later, we're $1 trillion in stimulus spending later, $800 billion of TARP. So it's pretty obvious if we couldn't afford them back then, in no way, shape, or form can we even dream about affording them now. Then Alan Greenspan reiterated that he supports allowing tax cuts enacted under President Bush to lapse at the end of 2010. And Ben Bernanke says, the only real question is whether adjustments to taxes and spending will come from a careful and deliberative process or from a rapid and painful response to a looming or actual fiscal crisis. So what can you do? For starters, find out where congressional candidates stand on extending the Bush-era tax cuts, and then vote for competent and fiscally responsible candidates. Some politicians will tell you whatever you want to hear because we tend to vote for people that tell us we can have our cake and eat it too and not even have to pay for it. When politicians promise a tax cut even though it's fiscal suicide, they're essentially buying your vote with your child's money. You can spread awareness by emailing this video to everyone you know. Demand that Congress takes immediate steps to solve our financial problems. And tell Congress that you'll support them when they make the tough but necessary choices. They need to know that we won't vote them out of office when they're honest with us and tell it like it is. Here are some additional resources to learn more about this issue. I highly recommend that you rent the movie IOUSA or at least watch the condensed 30-minute version for free online. Most of the information that I presented to you can be found on these websites for you to verify. Please forward this video now while you are thinking about it. We don't have time to waste. Our children's future depends on us fixing this problem. Thank you for your time and your effort.